7 minutes. That is how long 18 jeeps needed to reduce the Luftwaffe's forward supply base at Sidihan to a burning salvage yard. 7 minutes from the moment the green flare arced over the perimeter wire to the moment the last vehicle wheeled off the strip with tracer rounds still arcing behind it. Inside that window, 37 German aircraft were hit. Junkers 52 transports, the 3-engined cargo planes that kept Rommel's entire Africa Corps supplied with ammunition, spare parts, and food, stood in neat dispersal lines and were methodically torn apart by twin-mounted Vickers K machine guns firing incendiary tracer at a combined rate of over 1,200 rounds per minute. Fuel tanks ruptured, engines lit up from the inside. Whole fuselages collapsed in on themselves as aluminum frames turned to liquid under the heat of burning aviation spirit. On the airfield, anti-aircraft gunners and mechanics fired back into a confusion of headlights, muzzle flashes, and their own exploding aircraft. They had trained for an air attack. They had rehearsed for a bombing raid by night fighters. They had never rehearsed for what was actually happening, which was 4 men in an open jeep, headlights burning, driving a deliberate figure of 8 around their dispersal lines, while a 5th man on the rear gun mount swept the parked aircraft in long, disciplined bursts. When the column slid off the edge of the airfield and vanished into the desert, the Germans counted the wreckage and could not make the numbers add up. 37 aircraft, 1 Allied soldier killed, 1 jeep abandoned. An officer named Mike Sadler led the column back across 250 kilometers of unmarked dune seas, navigating by stars alone, to an oasis the Germans did not know they used. That raid was the 26th of July, 1942. It was neither the first nor the last of its kind. The question the Luftwaffe intelligence officers asked themselves afterwards, quietly and inside their own mess tents, was the same question that Italian staff officers had been asking their German counterparts for more than 18 months. How are they getting here? Not how are they fighting, because fighting in the desert had become the usual grim arithmetic of tanks and dive bombers and rifle companies strung out along the coast road. The question was simpler and more disturbing. How are 4 or 5 men in a stripped-down truck arriving at airfields that are 200 kilometers behind the front line, hitting them with catastrophic precision, and then vanishing into a desert that the Italian Royal Army had officially classified as impassable to motor vehicles? The answer to that question is a story the Axis High Command did not want told. It is a story about a warning the Italians gave Rommel the moment he stepped off the aircraft at Tripoli. It is a story about a dune system so vast and so hostile that Italian colonial surveyors had marked it on their maps as a dead zone. And it is a story about what happens when you ignore the people who have lived in a desert for a generation and assume that because a wasteland has defeated every expedition ever sent into it, it will defeat the British too. The year was 1941. North Africa was hanging on the edge of collapse for the Allies. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had arrived at Tripoli in February with orders from Hitler to rescue the Italian colonial army from the disaster it had brought upon itself in Libya. The Italian 10th Army had been shattered at Beit Afam in February 1941 with over 130,000 prisoners taken by General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force. Rommel's arrival reversed that fortune almost overnight. By April, his combined German-Italian armor had chased the British 8th Army back across Cyrenaica, stripped them of every forward airfield west of Tobruk, and pressed them up against the Egyptian frontier. The only remaining coastal anchor the Allies held west of the Egyptian border was the garrison of Tobruk itself, holding out in siege. Along the coast road, the battlefield was legible to any military planner. 2 armies strung out along a single ribbon of tarmac, fighting for control of water, port facilities, and the narrow strip of habitable ground between the Mediterranean and the southern desert. South of that strip was a second alien world, 700 kilometers of rock, gravel, and dune. A landscape that Italian colonial administrators had mapped incompletely, surveyed sporadically, and in large sections simply written off as uninhabitable. The Italians had been in Libya since 1911. They had fought an exhausting pacification campaign against the Senussi tribes of Cyrenaica through the 1920s and into the 1930s under the iron hand of General Rodolfo Graziani. They knew every track, well, and oasis that mattered. And they knew, with the certainty that comes from hard-won experience, that one particular feature of the interior desert could not be crossed by any modern army. That feature was the Great Sand Sea. It was not a single dune field, it was an ocean of sand on a continental scale. Roughly 72,000 square kilometers of parallel dune chains running north to south across the Egyptian-Libyan border, from the oasis of Siwa in the north, almost to the Sudanese frontier in the south. Individual dunes rose to 140 meters, steep-faced on the east, gentler on the west, packed and shaped by thousands of years of prevailing wind into ridges that a vehicle could neither climb nor skirt in any straightforward fashion. Between the ridges lay pockets of what the early desert travelers called liquid sand, soft material that would swallow a lorry up to its axles within seconds if the driver stopped moving. There was almost no water, there were almost no landmarks. Magnetic compasses behaved unreliably because of iron-bearing rock in places, and because the mass of a vehicle's own engine block could induce deviations of several degrees. An Egyptian prince named Kemal el-Din, who had led some of the earliest motor expeditions into the region in the 1920s, had judged the Great Sand Sea utterly impassable, a verdict the Italian Royal Geographical Service had effectively accepted. When Rommel landed at Tripoli, his Italian liaison officers gave him the standard colonial briefing on the interior. The line would have been delivered in varying forms, but with identical conclusions. You do not need to worry about the southern flank. The Great Sand Sea protects it. No serious force can move through it. You need only watch the coast road. The flank takes care of itself. Rommel accepted the assessment because there was no obvious reason to question it. The Italians had been in this desert for 30 years. They had lost men to it. They had mapped what could be mapped. Their advice was plain, professional, and rooted in experience. The advice was also about to be falsified by a quiet Royal Engineers officer who had spent a decade of his own life crossing the Sand Sea for pleasure. Ralph Alger Bagnold was not a soldier in any conventional sense. He was 44 years old in 1940, a geophysicist by inclination and a Royal Engineers signals officer by profession. Between 1925 and 1935, he had led a series of small private expeditions into the Libyan interior, funded in part by the Royal Geographical Society, using modified Model A Fords, fitted with oversized tires and his own hand-built equipment. He had made the first recorded east-to-west motorized crossing of the Libyan desert in 1932, covering roughly 4,000 kilometers of terrain across what Prince Kemal el-Din had called impossible. He had invented a sun compass, a brass disc with a central vertical pin that cast a shadow onto a graduated dial, entirely unaffected by iron ore or engine mass. He had developed techniques for condensing radiator steam back into drinking water through an overflow pipe rigged into a can on the bonnet. He had worked out by trial and painful error that reducing tire pressure to around 15 pounds per square inch transformed a two-wheel drive truck's behavior on soft sand. Most significantly of all, he had proven that the Great Sand Sea, the barrier the Italians believed to be uncrossable, contained a handful of practicable north-south routes that a competent navigator could memorize and follow. Bagnold had published the scientific backbone of all this in 1941 as The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes, a monograph still cited today in studies of dune mechanics. But in June 1940, when Italy declared war on the Allies, Bagnold was simply a middle-aged Royal Engineers major trying to get back to Cairo by troopship. A collision in the Mediterranean forced his vessel into port at Alexandria for repairs. He used the unscheduled week to walk into Middle East headquarters and propose to General Archibald Wavell, the commander-in-chief, an idea he had been refining in his head since the last Italian invasion scare of the mid-1930s. He wanted permission to form a small, self-contained mobile unit that could drive through the Great Sand Sea from the Egyptian side, gather intelligence on Italian garrisons deep in Libya, and report what no aerial reconnaissance could see. Wavell gave him 6 weeks and the rank of authority to requisition volunteers. Bagnold went looking not for hardened infantry, but for the kind of men he believed could live for weeks in seclusion on brackish water, malfunctioning vehicles, and open desert. New Zealand farmers. Over half of the New Zealand 2nd Division volunteered when the call went out. Bagnold took 2 officers and 85 other ranks, most of them from the Divisional Cavalry Regiment and the 27th Machine Gun Battalion. He trained them on his own modified Chevrolet trucks. He taught them his sun compass. He taught them to navigate by theodolite and the stars. He taught them to reduce tire pressure, to drive fast at a dune crest rather than slow, to carry fuel and water in amounts that seemed absurd to conventional quartermasters. And on the 5th of September 1940, 8 days before Marshal Graziani's army rolled east into Egypt along the coast road, Bagnold led the whole unit across the Egyptian Sand Sea into Libyan territory. They covered roughly 4,000 kilometers in their opening sweep. They watched Italian airfields from distances the Italians thought unreachable. They examined motor tracks the Italian Royal Army had assumed no one else would ever find. They returned undetected, with intelligence that caused a quiet shock in Cairo. The unit was formally named the Long Range Desert Group in November 1940. By the following spring, it had grown to 5 patrols, added Rhodesian and British volunteers, and begun to conduct offensive raids of its own, capturing the Italian fort at Kufra in March 1941 alongside Free French forces under Colonel Philippe Leclerc and taking 400 Italian prisoners in the process. The officer commanding the Italian garrison at Kufra, an experienced colonial soldier, had not believed motorized forces could arrive from the direction they arrived from. By the time he believed it, the surrender had already been signed. That was the strategic ground Rommel inherited without knowing he had inherited it. The southern flank of his entire theater, the flank his Italian hosts had assured him was sealed by nature, was in fact a highway for a new British unit operating from a string of oases and fuel dumps the Italians had not even catalogued. And Bagnold's men, by the spring of 1941, had begun to do something that would prove even more dangerous than reconnaissance. They had begun to ferry another man's ideas into Libya on the back of their trucks. A man named David Sterling. Archibald David Sterling was 25 years old, 6 feet 6 inches tall, and by most conventional military assessments, a walking disaster. He was a Scots Guards officer, son of Brigadier General Archibald Sterling of Keir, the sort of aristocratic Highland background that produced a particular strain of British officer. Before the war, he had been a hotelier in training, a mountaineer planning an assault on Everest, and an inveterate gambler who had dropped out of Cambridge. He had joined No. 8 Commando at the outbreak of war, deployed to the Middle East with Colonel Robert Laycock's amphibious raiding force, and watched it achieve almost nothing before being disbanded after heavy losses at Crete and the Litani River in Lebanon. In June 1941, he had broken his back and both his legs in an experimental parachute jump near Mersa Matruh, landing partly paralyzed and spending 6 weeks in a Cairo hospital. He spent those 6 weeks thinking. His idea was simple on paper and radical in practice. If the Italians believed the southern flank was impassable, and if Bagnold had already proved it was passable, then a very small number of highly trained men could use that flank to attack the one target that everything in North Africa ultimately depended on: aircraft. Both sides were fighting a logistics war along a single coast road. Both sides' logistics depended on air transport and air cover. Both sides parked those aircraft in long, orderly rows on forward airfields behind the front line. If a handful of determined men could walk onto those airfields in the middle of the night and attach incendiary charges to each aircraft, they could destroy in a single raid what a Desert Air Force squadron might need 2 months to destroy in aerial combat, and they could do it for almost no cost. In July 1941, Sterling, still on crutches, concealed himself under a car outside Middle East headquarters in Cairo, slipped through a gap in the perimeter wire, abandoned the crutches against a tree, and limped into the headquarters building in search of General Claude Auchinleck, the new commander-in-chief. He did not find Auchinleck. He found the deputy commander, General Neil Ritchie, whose office he entered partly by accident. Ritchie took the plan, found it interesting, and carried it up the chain. Within a week, Sterling had been promoted to captain and given permission to form a unit of 66 men, drawn from the surviving commandos and any other volunteers willing to transfer. The unit was formally named L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The title was a deliberate deception. Brigadier Dudley Clark's deception unit in Cairo had been trying to convince Italian and German intelligence that a full British parachute brigade was operating in Egypt. Sterling's tiny raiding force would be used to prove the fictional brigade's existence. The SAS was born as a deception operation before it had fired a shot. Sterling established his camp at Cabrit Air Base on the eastern shore of the Great Bitter Lake, roughly 160 kilometers south of Cairo. He had no tents, no cots, no tables, and no stores. The unit's first operation was to drive over to the nearest New Zealand regimental area by night and steal everything that could be carried off, including a piano. The unit's second task was serious. To train men who could perform the mission Sterling had in mind, he needed a training officer of unusual intellectual caliber. He found Lieutenant John Steele Lewis, always known as Jock. Lewis was 37, Oxford-educated, a former president of the Oxford University Boat Club who had rowed for the university crew. He was small, slight, precise, and almost painfully serious. He had volunteered for No. 8 Commando with Sterling and had already led small boat raids along the Libyan coast. He was a methodical thinker in a service that preferred instinct. Sterling took him aside and asked him to solve 2 problems. First, he had to design a training regime that would turn 66 men into the world's most lethal commandos in 10 weeks. Second, he had to invent a weapon that did not yet exist. Sterling had spent his hospital weeks working out that the aircraft-destroying bomb he needed could not be carried in any useful quantity by a man with a rucksack. Standard incendiary grenades weighed too much. Standard demolition charges produced blast but no fire. To destroy a parked aircraft, a man needed a charge that would rupture the fuselage and ignite the fuel tank in the same instant. He needed to carry a dozen of them at once, across 40 kilometers of desert, after a night parachute drop. The existing British inventory had nothing that fit. Lewis went to work with a set of improvised laboratory equipment and ended up, after weeks of trial and error, with a pound of Nobel 808 plastic explosive mixed with a quarter-pound of thermite and a small amount of diesel oil, wrapped in a small canvas sandbag and triggered by a time pencil detonator. The plastic explosive ripped the aircraft's skin. The thermite burned at nearly 2,000 degrees Celsius, enough to melt aluminum frame spars. The diesel soaked into the mixture and spread fire across wiring, fabric, and any adjacent fuel. It weighed 1 pound. A single SAS trooper could carry 15 or 20 of them on a raid. The device would later be assessed by a group of Italian engineers after a December 1941 attack when several unexploded Lewis bombs were recovered from aircraft at a raided airfield. The Italian engineers repaired the fuses, placed the bombs on derelict aircraft in the same positions the British had used, and tested them. Their report, preserved in Italian archives and paraphrased in several histories of the unit, concluded that in every case the charge set the fuel alight and destroyed the vehicle. The Italian assessors noted, with professional accuracy, that the lethal ingredient was not the bomb itself, but the precision with which it had been placed against the fuel tank. Someone, the Italians wrote, had trained these men to know exactly which part of every common German and Italian aircraft contained the fuel load. That knowledge came from the second half of Jock Lewis's training program. Cabrit in the autumn of 1941 was a place of accelerated misery. Lewis had his men running 30-mile marches in full kit before breakfast. He had them memorizing every significant Axis aircraft type: Junkers 52, Junkers 87 Stuka, Messerschmitt 109, Savoia Marchetti 79, Caproni 311. For each type, they had to learn by heart the exact location of the fuel tank, the engine's main firewall, the cockpit instrument panel. He had them rehearsing night navigation across the dunes behind the airfield, covering 25 miles in darkness and arriving at a specific point within a tolerance of 100 meters. He had them parachuting from converted Bristol-Bombay transports without instructors, without sufficient training time, and with equipment that was still being improvised. 2 men died on the first training jump when their static lines tore free of the aircraft's attachment rail. Lewis redesigned the attachment personally and jumped the following morning himself to prove the fix. The regime was brutal by any standard, but one. No man who could not complete it was going to survive Sterling's first raid. The first raid went ahead anyway, in conditions that should have canceled it, and it was a catastrophe. Operation Squatter was the SAS's combat debut. On the night of the 16th of November 1941, 55 men, divided into 5 sticks of 11, took off from an airfield near Bagnold to parachute onto 5 Axis airfields in Cyrenaica in advance of Operation Crusader, Auchinleck's offensive to relieve Tobruk. The weather on the drop zones was the worst the North African desert had seen in 30 years. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour. Visibility collapsed to nothing. The Bristol-Bombay pilots could not identify their drop zones against featureless sand and swirling dust. Paratroopers were scattered over hundreds of square kilometers. Some landed in the Mediterranean and drowned. Some were dragged for miles behind unreleasable parachutes and killed against rocks. Some broke ankles and legs on impact. Only 22 of the 55 returned. The mission objective was not achieved. No aircraft was destroyed. The survivors rendezvoused with Bagnold's long-range desert group patrols at a position in the Great Sand Sea and were driven out by the same route the LRDG had pioneered a year earlier. Sterling rode out of the desert beside an LRDG officer named David Lloyd Owen, who had already guessed what Sterling would take several more hours to admit to himself. Parachute insertion in North Africa did not work. The weather was too unpredictable, the drop zones too hard to identify, the wind too violent. But the desert itself was perfectly navigable. Bagnold's unit had been driving unmolested through exactly the terrain the Italians thought was impassable for more than a year. Lloyd Owen made the suggestion that would define the next 15 months of the Desert War. Instead of parachuting to their targets, the SAS could let the LRDG drive them there and drive them back. The distances were longer, the navigation was harder, the risk of interception during the long approach march was real. But the raid itself would arrive with all its men, all its kit, all its charges, and most critically, all its element of surprise intact. 3 weeks later, on the 8th of December, 1941, the new partnership was tested. Paddy Mayne, a 26-year-old Ulsterman, former Ireland rugby international, and a man whose capacity for controlled violence was already legendary inside the unit, led 5 men to the Italian coastal airfield at Tamat, west of Sirte. The LRDG dropped them 30 kilometers short. They walked in. Mayne pushed open the door of the airfield officer's mess with a loaded Colt .45 pistol and a Thompson gun between 2 other men and gunned down the occupants in a pocket of absolute chaos. The raiding party then moved unopposed across the airfield, placing Lewis bombs on every aircraft in the dispersal line and detonating the fuel pumps and ammunition dump on the way out. 24 aircraft destroyed. A line of telegraph poles blown down for good measure. no British casualties. Maine tore the directional gyro out of an Italian cockpit with his bare hands as a personal souvenir. It is still preserved at the National Army Museum in London. The same night, a second SAS team, led by Lieutenant Bill Fraser, raided the airfield at Agdabia and destroyed 37 aircraft. Fraser later apologized to Sterling for the inadequacy of his tally. He had run out of Lewis bombs with 2 parked aircraft remaining in the dispersal line, and they were the only 2 he had left behind. The combined raid that night, conducted by 15 men in total, destroyed 60 Axis aircraft without a single SAS fatality. The Italian and German Air Command structures in Cyrenaica began that week to reorganize their forward dispersal patterns. They spread aircraft over wider areas. They posted more sentries. They requested additional anti-aircraft defenses. The measures would not be enough. Jock Lewis, the man who had designed the bomb and the training that made the raid possible, did not survive that December. On the 30th, returning from his own raid on the airfield at Nophelia, his LRDG transport was caught in the open by an Italian Machi 202 fighter. He was killed by machine gun fire as the vehicle tried to make the cover of a wadi. He was 28 years old. David Sterling said of him, many years later, that Jock could far more genuinely claim to be the founder of the SAS than I. The Lewis bomb would go on to account for most of the aircraft destroyed by the unit for the remainder of the Desert War. Through the first half of 1942, the tempo of SAS raids accelerated. The LRDG ferry system worked. Sterling's men struck and vanished. The Italians, who had far more local knowledge than the Germans of the interior desert, understood what was happening and pushed warnings up the chain to the combined Axis command. The interior flank is no longer secure. The British have found a way to use the Sand Sea, reinforce the southern garrisons, increase air patrols over the dune systems, allocate armored cars to sweep the approaches. The Italian staff also tried to revive the pre-war services of Count Laszlo Almasi, the Hungarian desert explorer fictionalized in The English Patient, who had been a close friend of Bagnold's in the 1930s and knew the Sand Sea as well as any living European. Almasi would eventually conduct his own deep desert operations for the Abwehr. But the German response to the Italian warnings in 1941 and early 1942 was slow, partial, and grudging. Rommel was absorbed in his coastal battles. He had to prepare for Gazala. He did not have armor to spare for sweeping dunes that the Italians themselves had previously declared impassable. The Italian warnings kept coming. The Axis aircraft losses kept climbing. Through the spring and summer of 1942, Sterling's men hit Agdabia, Buerat, Benina, Berka, Bars, Derna, Martuba, Bagush, and Fuka. In a single night in mid-June 1942, a coordinated 7-airfield strike using French SAS personnel under Georges Berger and conventional SAS sticks under Maine and Sterling destroyed well over 60 aircraft across Cyrenaica. Maine personally destroyed between 35 and 40 aircraft at Bagush using the Lewis bomb, and when several bombs failed to detonate in unseasonal rain, simply drove back onto the airfield with a Vickers-mounted jeep and shot up the remaining aircraft with tracer rounds. The raid on Bagush alone destroyed an estimated 37 aircraft. By this point, the SAS had received its own transport. In the early summer of 1942, Sterling secured 20 American Willys Jeeps from the Cairo-based depot. They were stripped of everything non-essential, fitted with twin Vickers K drum-fed aircraft machine guns front and rear, supplementary front-mounted single Vickers K guns, Browning 0.5-inch heavy machine guns on several vehicles, jerrycan racks for fuel and water, and condensing gear for radiator steam. Each Jeep could carry 4 men plus fuel and water for roughly 900 kilometers of autonomous operation. The unit no longer needed the LRDG to carry it to its targets. It could drive itself. The LRDG would continue to provide deep navigation, road watch intelligence along the coast highway, and long-range pickup and drop-off for particularly complex operations, but the SAS now possessed its own mobile raiding capability. This was the capability that Sterling would deploy against Sidihan on the night of the 26th of July, 1942. The airfield had been identified by the LRDG's road watch parties as the main forward base for the Junkers 52 transport aircraft that kept the Afrika Korps supplied from Crete. Destroying the transports would cut Rommel's logistics at a critical moment, the weeks immediately after the First Battle of El Alamein, when the Afrika Korps had been stopped for the first time in its advance and was desperately short of fuel and spare parts. Sterling devised a tactic that the SAS had never used before. Rather than walking onto the airfield with charges, his 18 jeeps would drive onto it in a V formation, headlights on, and engage every parked aircraft with machine gun fire in a single coordinated pass. The approach was made across 250 kilometers of open desert from the SAS's operating base at an LRDG rendezvous near Karet Tartura. Mike Sadler, the SAS navigator who had transferred in from the LRDG, plotted the course using sun compass by day and stellar observation by night. The 18 jeeps drove in formation without lights for the final approach. As they reached the airfield perimeter, the strip lights were suddenly switched on, causing a moment of near panic among the raiders who thought they had been detected. In fact, the lights had been turned on to receive a late-arriving Luftwaffe bomber. Sterling fired his green Very flare. The jeeps deployed into their V and opened fire. In 7 minutes, they destroyed 37 aircraft, several Junkers, 52 transports, a number of Messerschmitt 109 fighters, Stuka dive bombers, a reconnaissance Heinkel, one SAS man, Lance Bombardier John Robson, aged 21, was killed by German return fire while manning his Vickers. One jeep was disabled. Paddy Mayne personally planted a charge on the engine of a parked aircraft after the firing had stopped, a final gesture. The column then split into small groups of 3 to 5 jeeps to evade air pursuit at dawn, camouflaged under scrim nets through the daylight hours, and withdrew across the desert. Only one group, French SAS personnel, delayed by repeated punctures, was caught in the open by Stuka dive bombers the following morning. The French paratrooper André Zirnheld was killed in that attack, his death later commemorated in the Prayer of the Paratroopers, which he had written and which is now recited at French airborne ceremonies. The Sidihan raid took the total of Axis aircraft destroyed by the Special Air Service to well over 300. The final tally, as calculated by the Warfare History Network and the National Army Museum from surviving operational records, reached over 400 aircraft destroyed in the 15 months between December 1941 and February 1943. Paddy Mayne's personal tally alone was in excess of 100 aircraft, more than twice the tally of any Allied fighter ace of the war. The unit that achieved this numbered, at its operational peak, fewer than 400 men, and in the crucial first year, fewer than 100. When Rommel finally acknowledged the scale of the problem, it was too late for him to shift the forces he would have needed to close the southern flank. He had other concerns. He had the 8th Army in front of him, now being rebuilt under Bernard Montgomery. He had his supply lines hemorrhaging through the western Mediterranean. And he had an Italian command structure, which was, with the bitter satisfaction of those whose warnings have been disregarded, now constantly pointing out that they had told him so. The sand sea, the dead ground, the flank that could not be threatened, had become the single most dangerous approach route in the entire theater. And it had become dangerous because one man, Ralph Bagnold, had personally falsified the Italian colonial assessment a decade before the war began. And another, David Sterling, had understood what Bagnold's falsification meant for a specific, narrow, and deadly operational idea. Sterling himself would be captured in Tunisia in January 1943, taken by an Afrika Korps reconnaissance unit operating in terrain he had thought was clear. He would spend the rest of the war in a series of prisoner-of-war camps, attempting escape on at least 4 occasions and eventually being sent to Colditz. His brother Bill Sterling would raise 2nd SAS. Paddy Mayne would assume command of 1st SAS Regiment, lead it through Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, and into Germany, and finish the war as one of the most decorated British soldiers of the Second World War. Recommended for the Victoria Cross at Oldenburg in April 1945, a recommendation later downgraded to a 4th Distinguished Service Order under circumstances that remain controversial. Jock Lewis's bomb would be used unchanged until 1945. Mike Sadler would navigate for the SAS into France. Bagnold's long-range desert group would go on to fight in the Aegean, the Balkans, and the Adriatic before being disbanded in 1945. The Italian warning delivered to Rommel in the spring of 1941 with the polite certainty of colonial experts who had been in the country for 30 years was in one sense entirely accurate. The Great Sand Sea had been impassable to every army that had ever tried to cross it before the Second World War. What the warning could not anticipate was the presence within the British order of battle of an eccentric Royal Engineers major who had spent his pre-war leisure personally working out every practicable route through it, and the presence alongside him of a 25-year-old Scots Guardsman with a broken back and an idea. The combination of Bagnold's geography and Sterling's violence turned the Italian warning into the central strategic miscalculation of the Desert War. 400 aircraft destroyed, 60 men at the operational peak doing most of the destroying. A desert nobody believed could be crossed being crossed almost nightly for 18 months. A warning delivered by experienced men, ignored by a field marshal, who had no reason at the time to doubt it, proved catastrophically wrong by a unit that at its founding fit inside a single camp at Cabrit with a stolen piano and a handful of improvised charges. The lesson is not that Rommel was foolish. He was not. The lesson is that every desert, every flank, every so-called impassable barrier is impassable only until someone studies it properly and commits men hardened enough to cross it. The Italians told Rommel not to worry about the Sand Sea. They were right about the desert. They were wrong about the men.